Imagine a business so powerful that it could bring a king to his knees, not with an army, but with a trade embargo. A business with no headquarters, no CEO, no single country to call home. Yet for nearly 5 centuries, this entity controlled the economy of an entire continent. It negotiated its own tax exemptions directly with monarchs. It ran its own courts. It even got veto power over who could inherit a throne. This wasn't a modern corporation. This wasn't a government. This was the Hanseatic League, a network of medieval merchants who, without really planning to, invented almost everything we recognize as modern finance. Double-entry bookkeeping, marine insurance, limited liability investment, transnational commercial law, bills of exchange, essentially paper money before there was paper money. And today, their ideas are still quietly running the world economy. So, how did a group of German fish and grain traders from the 1100s end up writing the software for global capitalism? Let's find out. To understand why the Hanseatic League became so powerful, you first need to understand just how chaotic medieval Europe actually was. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe essentially broke into hundreds of small pieces. Kings, dukes, local lords, military orders, everyone had their own tiny patch of land, their own rules, and their own coin. What we now call Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states was not one country. It was a patchwork of competing territories, each governed by a feudal lord who was mostly interested in two things: fighting his neighbors and taxing his merchants. And that last point is key. These lords had no real interest in growing trade or encouraging commerce. Merchants were just a source of revenue to them, like a cash cow you milked whenever you needed money for a war. Long-distance trade was incredibly dangerous. Roads were poor. Pirates patrolled the seas. If your ship sank, you lost everything. And if you somehow made it to your destination safely, a local lord might confiscate your goods anyway, because he felt like it, or because some obscure local rule gave him the right. This was the environment in which merchants began to think, what if we stopped doing this alone? The first real spark happened around 1143, when the city of Lübeck was founded on the eastern side of the Elbe River, a strategic location sitting right between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Geographically, a perfect transit hub. By 1160, German merchants had set up a key trading station in Visby, on the island of Gotland in the Baltic. And then in 1241, the cities of Lübeck and Hamburg signed a formal agreement to protect trade routes and share the risks of long-distance travel. That handshake between two cities would eventually become one of the most powerful economic alliances in human history. The word Hansa itself comes from an old Germanic word meaning a troop or company of traveling merchants. And that's exactly what they were, a company. Just one without a government, a permanent army, or a single treasury. What they had instead was something arguably more powerful: aligned self-interest. Before we get into how the League operated, it's worth understanding what it was actually trading, because the business model itself was a masterpiece of geographic arbitrage. Picture a map of Europe. On the eastern side, you have the vast hinterlands of Russia and Poland. Resource-rich, but economically underdeveloped. Enormous forests, fertile plains, teeming rivers. From these territories, the Hansa extracted raw materials on a massive scale. Grain to feed growing western cities, timber and pitch to build ships, beeswax for the candles that lit churches and counting houses across the continent, honey, hemp, and furs, the luxury goods of the medieval world, the equivalent of designer clothing today. All of this moved westward, carried in the holds of Hanseatic cogs, toward the wealthy, industrialized cities of Flanders and England. And in return, the West sent back what the East couldn't yet produce for itself. High-quality English wool, the finest in Europe, the raw material for the cloth industry. Flemish cloth, processed, dyed, finished fabric, worth a premium in every Baltic city. Manufactured goods, tools, and luxury items that the resource-rich East craved but couldn't make at scale. This loop, raw materials east to west, manufactured goods west to east, was the engine of the entire Hanseatic economy, and the League sat directly in the middle of it. They didn't produce anything themselves, they moved things. They controlled the infrastructure of exchange, the ships, the routes, the trading posts, the financial instruments. In modern terms, they weren't the factory, they were the supply chain. This geographic position gave them extraordinary leverage. If you were a Russian fur merchant who needed to reach markets in Bruges, you went through the Hansa. If you were an English wool exporter who needed buyers in the Baltic, you went through the Hansa. There was simply no viable alternative, because the League had spent decades systematically eliminating every alternative, through better ships, better infrastructure, and better financial terms than any competitor could offer. It was, by any measure, one of the most elegant monopolies ever constructed. Every great commercial empire needs a great logistics network. For the Roman Empire, it was roads. For the British Empire, it was the Royal Navy. For the Hanseatic League, it was a ship called the cog. Before the cog came along, Northern European merchants mostly used Viking-style vessels. Fast, nimble, great for exploration. But here's the problem with Viking ships. They weren't built for volume. A typical Viking cargo ship carried maybe 15 to 30 tons of goods and needed a large crew to operate. The cog completely changed the math. The Hanseatic cog had high sides, a single large sail, a stern rudder for better navigation, and, crucially, a flat bottom. That flat bottom sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. It meant the cog could sail into shallow coastal waters, and when the tide went out, it could just sit flat on a mudflat. Merchants could then load and unload heavy cargo directly onto carts. No expensive deep-water port infrastructure needed. And the cargo capacity? A large cog could carry 200 tons or more, roughly 6 or 7 times what a Viking ship could manage, with a crew of only about 15 to 20 men. Think about that from a pure business perspective. You're moving 6 times the product with roughly the same number of people. Your cost per unit of cargo dropped dramatically. Margins went up. And the whole trade network became economically viable at a scale it had never been before. But the League didn't stop at just building better ships. They thought about the entire logistics chain. Dangerous coastlines meant shipwrecks, and shipwrecks meant losing cargo, which meant losing money. So they invested in infrastructure. In 1202, the city of Lübeck built what is considered Northern Europe's first proper lighthouse in Falsterbo, Sweden. By 1600, Hansa-affiliated entities had built at least 15 lighthouses across the Scandinavian and German coasts, making it the best-lit maritime network in the world. They also trained and certified specialized maritime pilots to guide ships through the most dangerous straits. They were, in effect, subsidizing the safety of their own supply chain. And by doing that, they created a massive barrier to entry for rival merchants who simply didn't have access to the same navigational intelligence. They also standardized weights and measurements. The standard unit for cog loading capacity was the last, about 2 metric tons. A modest cog carrying 50 lasts was the logistical equivalent of 54-horse freight wagons. Standardized units might sound boring, but they're actually the backbone of any functional trade network. When a buyer in Lübeck orders grain from a seller in Danzig, both parties need to agree on exactly what a shipment means. The Hansa made that agreement universal across hundreds of cities. This was, essentially, medieval containerization. So far, we've talked about what the Hanseatic League built. Now let's talk about who was allowed inside, because the admission criteria were extraordinary, and understanding them explains a great deal about how the League protected its wealth. The short version is this. The Hanseatic League was one of the most exclusive clubs in human history. As the League became wildly profitable, the merchants quickly realized they needed to lock outsiders out. And so, they introduced a rule that was as simple as it was brutal. To be recognized as a Hanseatic merchant, you had to be born inside a recognized Hanseatic member city. Not move there, not marry into it, born there. And not just born as what guild records called a man of honest birth. That meant being born legitimately, as a freeman, typically with a German pedigree. If your background was English, Russian, Flemish, no matter how wealthy or talented you were, the inner circle of the League was closed to you. The second layer of protection was the language. The mandatory operating language of the entire Hanseatic network was Middle Low German, a specific dialect of medieval German. All legal contracts, accounting ledgers, business correspondence, and trade negotiations were conducted in this language and only this language. This wasn't an accident. If you were an English merchant in London or a Russian trader in Novgorod, your inability to read or speak this specific dialect naturally locked you out of every meaningful transaction in the Hanseatic system. The language was, deliberately, a password, and it worked remarkably well. The Hanse's commercial dominance stretched from England to Russia, but the inner workings of the network remained opaque to anyone outside it. Being born to the right family and speaking the right language still wasn't enough. Young men entering the merchant class were put through a rigorous multi-year apprenticeship, usually arranged through a family friend or relative who was an established merchant. First came the fundamentals: double-entry bookkeeping, trade logistics, the mechanics of credit instruments. Then came the real test. These teenagers, often as young as 15 or 16, were shipped off to foreign trading posts. The Steelyard in London, the Contour in Novgorod, the Post in Bruges. Working as junior partners under senior merchants, they had to prove they could handle the local markets, build a spotless reputation, and, crucially, be trusted with the family's capital. Only after completing this process were they allowed to operate their own ships and conduct independent trade. And here's a detail your audience will enjoy. When a young man of honest birth was finally ready to formally join a merchant guild, there was one last requirement to seal the deal. Historical guild records show that the initiation levy, the price of admission, was a specific, non-negotiable, slightly absurd contribution: half a barrel of beer. Not gold, not silver, half a barrel of beer, offered to the guild to finalize membership. Centuries of financial sophistication, and the entry fee was a round of drinks. It's a small detail, but it's a reminder that for all the complexity of the Hanseatic system, these were still very human institutions, built by people who like to drink as much as a profit margin. So now we know who could join the League, but how did it actually govern itself across hundreds of cities and thousands of merchants, with no central government, no standing army, and no permanent administration? The answer is fascinating, and it evolved significantly over time. In the very early days of the League, it was an association of individual traveling merchants who banded together purely to share financial risk. Pirates, shipwrecks, hostile lords, the dangers of the road were simply better survived together. This early form was known as the Kaufmannshanse, the merchant Hanse. But as foreign rulers grew more powerful and started pushing back against these merchant monopolies, it became clear that individual traders needed real political leverage, not just commercial cooperation. So, around the mid-1300s, the network transformed into the Städte Hanse, the city Hanse. From this point forward, it was no longer individual merchants who held formal power. It was city councils, the governing bodies of member cities, who acted collectively as the shareholders of this vast commercial empire. Here's something remarkable about the Hanseatic League's structure. It had no formal constitution, no central treasury, and, astonishingly, no official membership list. A city didn't formally apply and get approved in a modern bureaucratic sense. Instead, a city effectively joined by adopting shared legal codes, most commonly the Law of Lübeck, which standardized commercial and legal practices, and by participating actively in the mutual trade network. Lübeck was the acknowledged center of the League. It was where most major assemblies were held, and it was widely regarded as the first among equals. Formal collective decisions, including the admission of new towns, the resolution of major disputes, and the setting of trade policy, were handled at the Hanseatic Diet, or Hansetag in German. This was an irregular assembly, not held on a fixed schedule, but convened when major decisions needed to be made. City delegates gathered, debated, and voted on league-wide policies. Think of it as a medieval board meeting for a corporation with hundreds of shareholders. The Diet's most powerful tool wasn't a weapon, it was a word. If a member city broke a league agreement, maybe it was trading independently with an enemy, undermining collective pricing, or sheltering piracy, the Diet could vote to expel it. This punishment had a name, being verhunzt. And being verhunzt was economic death. An expelled city was immediately and completely boycotted by every other Hanseatic city simultaneously. No Hanseatic merchant would trade with you. No Hanseatic ship would enter your harbor. No credit, no supply chain, no access to the network that, in many cases, was the only reason your city was economically viable in the first place. The threat of this punishment, more than any army, was what kept member cities in line. It was compliance through consequence. And notice something important here. This entire system, the shared legal codes, the collective decision-making, the boycott mechanism, operated without a sovereign state behind it. No king enforced the law of Lübeck. No army backed the Diet's rulings. The Hanse enforced itself through the rational self-interest of its members. Cooperate and prosper, defect and be cut off. It is, in miniature, a model of how stateless institutions can generate and enforce order, a question that political economists and legal theorists are still wrestling with today. Here's where things get really interesting, because the Hanseatic League wasn't just a shipping company. It was also, quietly, one of the most important financial innovators in history. As trade volumes grew, the old way of keeping track of money, basically just writing down what you spent and what you earned, stopped working. Transactions were getting complicated, goods moving across multiple cities, payments in different currencies, debts that wouldn't be settled for months. The solution was double-entry bookkeeping. The idea is simple but profound. Every single financial transaction gets recorded twice, once as money going out, once as money coming in. The two sides have to balance. If they don't, something is wrong. This might seem like a minor accounting detail, but consider what it actually meant. A merchant sitting in his counting house in Lübeck could now, mathematically, know whether a trading partner in Novgorod, more than 1,000 kilometers away, was financially healthy or heading toward bankruptcy. Information became a financial weapon, and the Hansards used it. The League operated across dozens of feudal jurisdictions, each minting their own coins with slightly different silver content and weight. Trying to do business across all of those was like buying something today when everyone uses a different currency with unpredictable exchange rates. The Hanse's solution was elegant. They anchored their financial system to the Cologne mark, a precise silver weight of about 234 grams. By 1255, major Hanse cities agreed to peg their local coins to exact fractions of this standard. It wasn't a single currency, but it functioned like one, a stable reference point that gave traders across the entire Baltic and North Sea region a reliable pricing standard. The legacy of this? When Germany unified as a nation in 1871, it named its official currency the mark, a direct nod to this Hanseatic standard. But moving physical silver was dangerous. Pirates, shipwrecks, greedy nobles confiscating cargo. So the Hanse developed and scaled something called the Bill of Exchange. Here's how it worked. A merchant in Lübeck deposits silver with a Hanse agent. He receives a paper document, essentially a voucher. He sends that paper to his contact in Bruges, who redeems it with a Hanse agent there. Capital moved across a continent without a single coin changing hands. This was, in essence, the birth of paper money as a practical financial tool. And it was not without controversy. Historical records show merchants arguing bitterly over the explosion of these credit instruments. Conservative traders feared that too much paper credit could cause a chain reaction. Everyone calls in their debts at once, and the system implodes. They were debating, in the 13th century, the exact same thing that modern central bankers call systemic credit risk. The Hansards got there first. Here's one that most people have never heard of, and it's arguably the direct ancestor of modern venture capital. Long before the Dutch East India Company issued public shares, Hanseatic merchants were using two specific financial structures to pool capital and limit individual risk. The first was the syndave, a maritime transport arrangement where a merchant could consign goods to a traveling agent or shipmaster who would conduct transactions on their behalf. The sedentary investor back home shared in the profits without ever having to leave his counting house. Sound familiar? This is essentially the earliest form of sales on commission and the direct precursor of modern agency law. The second was the veto, a short-term joint venture for a specific voyage. One party, the passive investor, provided the capital. The other party, the active partner, undertook the physical journey and executed the actual trade. Profits and losses were divided according to a pre-agreed formula. Notice what this does. The investor gets exposure to the profits of a potentially very lucrative trade route, without risking death at sea. The active merchant gets access to capital he might not otherwise have. Both parties are incentivized to make the voyage a success. This structure, passive money plus active management, profits split by formula, is the fundamental architecture of a limited partnership. The same arrangement that today governs most private equity funds, hedge funds, and venture capital firms in the world. The Hansards invented it in the 1300s to ship grain across the Baltic. Wall Street uses a version of it today to fund technology startups. Every merchant in the league faced the same existential problem: the sea. A ship going down could mean total financial ruin for everyone involved. To manage this, the Hansa formalized one of the oldest principles in maritime law: general average. The rule is simple. If a ship is in danger and the crew has to throw some cargo overboard to save the vessel, everyone involved in the voyage, ship owner and all cargo owners, shares the financial loss proportionally. Without this rule, you get a paralysis problem. When a storm hits and the captain says, "We need to jettison cargo," every merchant starts arguing about whose goods get sacrificed. The debate kills time. The ship sinks. General average removes the argument. The loss is shared. The decision is made. The ship is saved. The Hansa also used bottomry bonds, loans taken against the hull of a ship to finance a voyage. If the ship was lost at sea, the debt was forgiven. To compensate the lender for that enormous risk, they charged a much higher interest rate than a normal loan. The difference between that rate and a regular rate was, effectively, the world's first systematically priced maritime insurance premium. Medieval finance, built on very modern logic. A network this large needed physical footholds in foreign markets. And here is something important to clarify before we go further, because it's one of the most common misconceptions about the League. London, Bergen, Bruges, and Novgorod were not members of the Hanseatic League. They were host cities, places where the League established its major foreign trading posts, known as cantors. The local English, Norwegian, and Flemish merchants living in those cities had absolutely nothing to do with the League's membership. In fact, as we'll see, they often deeply resented it. Think of a cantor as a medieval special economic zone, a walled compound in a foreign city where Hanseatic merchants lived, worked, and operated under their own laws, with their own courts, entirely separate from the host country's legal system. The London cantor, known as the Steel Yard, is the most fascinating example. Located on the north bank of the Thames, just south of London Bridge, it was a walled, gated complex of about 1.3 acres, containing warehouses, a great guild hall, residential quarters, kitchens, and even a wine cellar. Inside those walls, Hansa merchants enjoyed privileges that English merchants could only dream of. Under royal charters granted by multiple English kings, Hansards paid customs duties of just 3 pence per pound of goods traded. English merchants paid 5 pence. That gap might sound small. Over tens of thousands of transactions, it was a mathematically insurmountable competitive advantage. Local merchants couldn't compete on equal terms in their own domestic market, and they hated it. But to maintain that monopoly, the League imposed extraordinary discipline on its merchants stationed abroad. The lifestyle inside the contours was, by design, almost monastic. Merchants living in the steelyard were forbidden to marry, specifically forbidden from marrying local women. Women were not permitted inside the compound at all. The fear was simple. A Hanseatic merchant who married into an English trading family might start sharing trade secrets, splitting capital, or developing divided loyalties. Strict nightly curfews were enforced. Merchants were explicitly barred from playing games or socializing intimately with the local population, not out of cultural snobbery, but to avoid quarrels or entanglements that could jeopardize the League's delicate diplomatic standing with the English crown. They even imported their own Rhenish wine, ensuring that money spent inside the steelyard flowed back into the Hanseatic economy rather than enriching local English taverns. The result was a highly efficient, impenetrable corporate campus, optimized entirely for the extraction of value. The Hansards were an elite expatriate class operating in a country whose merchants resented them, and whose kings tolerated them only because the tax revenue they generated was too valuable to refuse. Operating across competing sovereign territories meant local courts were useless for resolving trade disputes. A judge in Hamburg had no authority in Bruges. A law in Lübeck meant nothing in Novgorod. So the Hansa developed its own legal system, the Lex Mercatoria, the law merchant. This was a privately produced, privately enforced body of commercial law, adjudicated not by royal courts, but by experienced merchants themselves, people who actually understood delayed shipments, damaged cargo, and the practical realities of maritime trade. It was fast. It was pragmatic. It worked. The influence ran deep. In the 18th century, Lord Mansfield, the Chief Justice of England's highest court, formally integrated Hanseatic commercial customs into English common law. Today, the principles of the law merchant live on in international commercial arbitration and in institutions like the World Trade Organization. The Hanseatic preference for private dispute resolution over national courts is now the standard approach for almost every major cross-border business contract in the world. For all its sophistication as a financial and legal network, the Hanseatic League was not above using brute economic force, or actual force, when it needed to. Their most powerful weapon was the trade embargo. Because they controlled the flow of vital commodities, grain, timber, salt, herring, they could threaten entire kingdoms with economic strangulation. Starving populations are a very persuasive negotiating tool. The most dramatic example came in the conflict with King Valdemar IV of Denmark in the late 1360s. Valdemar wanted to control the narrow straits connecting the Baltic and North Seas and tax every Hanseatic ship that passed through. The League's response was swift. A coalition of 77 Hansa cities raised a fleet, defeated the Danish forces, and forced a settlement. The resulting Treaty of Stralsund in 1370 didn't just give the Hansa free navigation, it granted them veto power over the succession of the Danish throne. Let that land. A private commercial alliance had just won the right to approve or disapprove who became the next king of an entire country. No military conquest, no territorial claim, just economic leverage deployed ruthlessly. Then there were the pirates. The Baltic and North Seas were plagued by a sprawling piracy syndicate known as the Victual Brothers, led by a man who became something of a folk legend in Germany, Klaus Störtebeker. Operating from a fortified base in Visby, Störtebeker's fleet systematically raided Hanseatic cargo ships, targeting high-value goods like wax, salt, and potash. The League, led by Hamburg, organized a naval campaign specifically to hunt him down. In 1401, Stortebeker was captured off the island of Heligoland. His execution was staged as a piece of corporate deterrence. According to legend, Stortebeker negotiated a last deal with the mayor of Hamburg. Any of his men that his headless body could walk past after his execution would be pardoned. The story goes that his decapitated body walked past 11 of his crew before the executioner tripped him. The mayor, pragmatically, executed everyone anyway. The severed heads of all 73 men were mounted on stakes along the Elbe River, a clear message to anyone considering a career in pirating Hanseatic supply chains. So what happened to the League? By the 1500s, the world was changing in ways the Hanseatic model couldn't keep up with. Powerful, centralized nation-states began to emerge: England, France, Spain. And these new governments had little patience for a foreign commercial monopoly operating on their soil with special privileges. In 1598, Queen Elizabeth I formally revoked the Hanse's trading privileges in England and ordered the merchants of the Steelyard to leave. Around the same time, a new kind of competitor appeared: the state-backed joint stock company. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, combined government military backing with corporate finance on a scale the decentralized Hanse simply couldn't match. The Hanseatic League held its final formal gathering in 1669. After 5 centuries, the alliance quietly dissolved. But its ideas never died. The most visible heir to the Hanseatic legacy is probably Lufthansa, the German airline. When it was founded in 1926, the name was chosen deliberately. Hanse was meant to evoke the commercial confidence, reliability, and global reach of the medieval league. Then there's Hapag-Lloyd, one of the world's leading container shipping companies. Through its subsidiary, Hanseatic Global Terminals, established in 2023, the company manages stakes in 21 port terminals across 11 countries and 5 continents. Their luxury cruise ships are literally named Hanseatic: nature, Hanseatic inspiration, and Hanseatic spirit. The brand survives because the values it represents, reliability, network power, logistical precision, are exactly what global commerce still needs. But perhaps the most striking modern echo came in February 2018, when the finance ministers of 8 northern European countries, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, and Sweden, signed a document formally creating the new Hanseatic League. No, really, they called it that. The context was Brexit. With the UK leaving the European Union, these fiscally conservative, free trade-oriented northern nations suddenly lost a key counterweight to the more expansionary economic policies favored by southern European countries. So they did exactly what their medieval predecessors would have done. They formed a coalition. The new Hanseatic League now advocates collectively within the EU for fiscal discipline, debt sustainability, and the completion of a unified capital market system. In 2018, the group demanded that before the EU's Stability Fund could bail out struggling member states, those states should undergo formal debt sustainability tests. 8 small nations, acting together, were able to hold that line in a room full of much larger economies. The medieval playbook still works. So why does any of this matter? Because the Hanseatic League is a case study in something that keeps happening throughout history, and is happening right now. Private networks, when organized well enough, can outmaneuver sovereign governments. They can build legal systems, financial systems, and logistical networks faster than any state bureaucracy. Think about today's tech multinationals. Like the Hanse, they operate across dozens of sovereign borders. Like the Hanse, they negotiate preferential tax treatment with host nations. Like the Hanse, they operate in legal gray zones that national courts struggle to govern. Where the Hansards used extraterritorial contours to avoid English taxation, modern corporations use offshore subsidiaries and intellectual property domiciled in tax havens to achieve the same result. Different technology, same strategy. The friction between sovereign governments trying to tax digital revenues and stateless corporations shielding their profits in the cloud is a direct continuation of the conflict between English trade guilds and the privileged merchants of the Steelyard. 800 years apart, same argument. The walls of the London Steel Yard are long gone. The trading posts of Novgorod have crumbled. The last Hansa Diet was called centuries ago. But pick up any international commercial contract today. Look at the arbitration clause, the part that says disputes won't be settled in a national court, but by a private arbitration body. That's the law merchant. Look at your bank's accounting system. Double-entry bookkeeping. Still running, still balancing. Look at any venture capital term sheet. One partner brings money, the other brings expertise. Profits split by formula. That's the wetter legging. Look at how shipping companies price insurance for dangerous routes. General average is still a foundational principle of maritime law. And the next time you board a Lufthansa flight or watch a container ship navigate into port under the name Hanseatic Global Terminals, you're looking at the direct descendants of a group of medieval grain traders from Lübeck who decided, sometime in the 1100s, that cooperation was more profitable than going it alone. They built a monopoly with no government. They enforced law with no courts. They moved wealth with no banks. They were right